Hello everyone. In this presentation, we shall learn about what is the difference between hyperinflation and galloping inflation. And so we'll know how is hyperinflation different from galloping inflation. So what is hyperinflation? Hyperinflation in short is a very high and accelerating inflation that is usually accompanied by rapid and excessive increase in prices of goods, services, and real assets. There is no specific level beyond which inflation is classified as hyperinflation, but roughly a ballpark number of 50% inflation level per month is when hyperinflation is hyperinflation is considered. Basically, inflation is considered as in the hyperinflation territory. Just for reference, US normally aims for inflation levels of around 2% per annum. India, which is a developing country, aims for inflation of around 5% per annum. While in the last hyperinflationary episode in Venezuela that happened in 2019, the inflation levels reached to almost 283,000% in April 2019. That is hyperinflation. So now, what is galloping inflation or very high inflation? In galloping inflation, unlike in hyperinflation, inflation rates are high, but only in high double digits or even in triple digits. Galloping inflation can be a milestone before a country on its road towards hyperinflation. Also, sometimes the reasons for galloping inflation can be same as hyperinflation, but as we'll see, to a lesser degree. And unlike hyperinflation, sometimes wrong government and central bank policies can also be a trigger for the galloping inflation. So what causes hyperinflation? Or how does hyperinflation occur? You have to understand this, that hyperinflation is a highly unusual phenomenon. It's not every day we get hyperinflation. And hence the trigger really is not immediate wrong government or central bank fiscal or monetary policies. Well, because otherwise most of the nations, most of the times, would be in hyperinflation because these two entities make so many mistakes. So when the government expands its fiscal deficit and prints money via central banks, it will not cause hyperinflation. Sure, it can cause high inflation, but for hyperinflation, it may not cause hyperinflation. For that, because for that to happen, hyperinflation is almost always caused due to a supply shock or excessive buildup of foreign debt over a period of time, resulting in a currency crisis. Now, why do I say that? Let's look at a scenario. Here, let's say that the government of a country increases its fiscal deficit. Now, in order to fund that fiscal deficit, it prints money via the central bank. So the money supply or the credit in the economy increases. That means the demand in the economy will increase. Now to cater to this demand, let's assume in the first case that the production capacity in the economy is not sufficient. So unfortunately, to cater the increased demand, the supply doesn't change, which means more demand, less supply, increased credit in the economy means we get higher inflation. There can be a second scenario, of course, in which the economy is still not at its optimum level, and so in this case the supply does increase, which means there will not really be an increase in inflation. So let's go further in the first scenario where the inflation increases. And also we note one thing here, that the debt that the government takes is in domestic currency, which is important. So let's continue. To cater to this increase in demand, since domestic supply is insufficient, the imports increase. And that means the foreign exchange or the exchange rate of the country tends to start to decline. And due to this, the inflation increases further. Due to higher inflation, due to this particular higher inflation would in turn mean that demand tends to fall. So think about it. A higher demand meets the roadblock of supply in the domestic market, which led to increase in imports, in turn increase in inflation, which actually destroys the demand. So the circle is complete. The demand that led to inflation, that very inflation killed the demand. Of course, this cycle can be made worse by wrong monetary policies, increasing money supply, increase demand further. But this, you get the idea how natural corrective measures in the economy can alleviate the inflation pressures in the economy. And so inflation comes down finally. Now let's have a look at the scenario where there is a supply shock in the economy. So here, the supply of the economy dramatically declines. And when I say dramatically, it means decline of 30, 40, 50%, which has happened. It's not common, but it has happened. And that's why hyperinflation is not so common. Supply declines dramatically. That means, however, even though supply has declined, the credit or the money supply in the economy is still the same. That means the demand in the economy is still the same. Demand is same, but corresponding supply has declined dramatically. That means there certainly will be inflation and price rise because credit and demand is more than the supply available. And hence, like previously we saw, the imports are going to rise. These rising imports, again, like previously we saw, will lead to exchange fall in the exchange rate for the country. Now, here lies the difference. Unlike previously, here the demand will not fall substantially. Now, what is the reason behind this? Remember, in the first case, the demand increased due to government's increase in fiscal deficit. So that was the excess demand. In this case, there is no excess demand. The demand is still the same. Instead, the supply has fallen dramatically. So, for example, there is always demand for some goods in the economy. I mean, people do have to eat, right? People do have to wear clothes. People would need some medical supplies. These are some basic demands which cannot be culled beyond a point in the economy. They will remain. And so, in this particular case, since there was no excess demand, but the supply has declined dramatically, unlike previously, the demand remains almost the same and doesn't decline. And that's a very important distinction. And so, to cater to this demand, since the domestic supply cannot come online, the country starts taking in more foreign debt, which increases the country's foreign debt. And due to this, the exchange rate declines even further. A fall in exchange rate forces the interest rates to rise in the market. So, increasing inflation, increasing interest rates, a fall in exchange rate, all these contribute to further supply shock in the economy. because the capital, domestic capital has become even more expensive. The prices of inputs have become even more expensive, and so supply has become will eventually get even more less in the economy. So supply declining even further, demand almost remaining constant, would lead to finally a hyperinflationary episode in the economy. Now let's look how excessive foreign debt is what triggers the hyperinflationary episode in the economy. Now, here the country's foreign debt increases dramatically in the economy, which in turn means basically the country is importing large amount of goods than it's exporting. So that leads to finally a, a waterfall decline in its exchange rate. That would mean the prices in the economy would rise. The interest rates, as we saw previously again, would rise. And both these things contribute to a sharp fall in the supply. So, like previously we saw, wherein first of all, a supply shock in the economy led to a foreign debt and a currency crisis, finally leading up to hyperinflation. In this case, the foreign debt and currency crisis led to a supply shock in the economy, and which finally led to hyperinflation, as again the demand remains constant because it's base demand. Unlike the first case where we saw the excessive demand caused by fiscal deficit, again here it's the base demand, it's not excessive demand. So that remains almost constant, leading to hyperinflation. So points to note, as in the first scenario I told you, the government intervention created excessive demand, leading to inflation. So some inflation caused by excessive demand led to the demand destruction, as we saw. In the second scenario, or in the first hyperinflationary scenario, the demand was not excessive, like we saw, because it's the supply that collapsed by, let's say, around 50%. This caused inflation to spike up because the demand was not excessive, but the supply fell. This caused the inflation to spike up. So even the increase in inflation could not really destroy that demand, unlike previously. And as we saw, the crisis worsened due to an accompanied debt crisis. So generally we see that hyperinflationary episodes are accompanied by supply shocks and debt crisis, or foreign exchange crisis, as you may call it. And this is because since the supply locally cannot cater to demand, countries start importing goods, and that import of goods piles up the foreign debt and makes exchange rate tumble. In the third scenario, or in the second hyperinflationary scenario, we saw how foreign debt led to a increased buildup in foreign debt, coupled with the falling exchange rate, caused a hyperinflationary scenario. This again was coupled with the limited productive capacity of the economy. We saw this scenario play out in Venezuela, this hyperinflation in Venezuela 2019. So let's now see how does galloping inflation hits the economy. So we'll take the very first scenario which we took earlier, wherein the wrong government policies caused inflation. However, that same inflation led to reduction in demand and ultimately cured itself. So then here again, basically the high inflation caused due to wrong government policies, loose government fiscal and monetary policies, led to the decline in demand, which ultimately led to the fall in inflation. However, due to the fall in demand and hence growth, the central government intervenes by increasing its fiscal deficit. So in order to do that, the central government issues debt, and the debt this time is bought by the central bank through freshly printed money, which it in turn hands over to the central government to spend. So basically, there is increase in money supply in the economy, which leads to further increase in demand in spite of higher inflation. So that further increase in demand in spite of higher inflation, which cannot be catered by the supply, the domestic supply, leads to even higher inflation. And that higher inflation turns into galloping inflation finally. Now, of course, the central government can intervene in another way. So, in this way, it can sell its debt instead of to the central bank to the domestic investors. Now, herein, what happens is no fresh new money is created in the economy. However, because of the existing money pool, a larger share is taken by the central bank, crowding out can occur, leaving lesser money for the private investors, raising the interest rates, which would in turn means that the new investments in the supply declines. So then what happens? So the demand this time again increases because of the central government spending. However, things are made even worse because this time, as the central government has taken more money supply and hence increases the interest rate for private investors, the supply has also declined. So increase in demand, but at the same time decline in supply further, leading to galloping inflation. Now let's take one of the scenarios that we took in, in the hyperinflation scenario and see how reasons for hyperinflation to a lesser degree can cause galloping inflation. So in this scenario, instead of the supply shock being very high to the extent of 30, 40, 50%, which we saw in hyperinflation, here the fall in supply is little lower. Now this lower fall in supply would imply that instead of the first case, where the demand could never adjust to that shocking fall in supply, because as we discussed earlier, there will always be some latent demand in the economy that cannot be culled. Due to the fact that the supply fall was very small or smaller, here there can be some adjustment in the demand. And so the hyperinflation scenario would instead be replaced by a high price rise scenario. Now, again, due to this high price rise and due to small fall in demand and supply, that is fall in growth, the government again intervenes through its loose monetary and fiscal policies. And so the demand, instead of staying flat or going a little lower, instead starts to rise. And as we saw earlier, this rise in demand in the wake of little falling in supply would lead to galloping inflation. So in conclusion, hyperinflation, as we saw, is highly unusual, and the trigger is not really the central bank or the government fiscal and monetary policies. They can cause high inflation, but not really hyperinflation. Trigger for hyperinflation almost always comes from a supply shock or an excessive foreign debt buildup, resulting into sovereign debt and currency crisis. So almost every hyperinflationary episode is triggered due to supply shock that ends up being a sovereign debt crisis or currency crisis. And similarly, almost every foreign or sovereign debt crisis and currency crisis ends up being a hyperinflationary episode due to severe supply constraints in the economy. As far as galloping inflation is concerned, as we saw earlier, galloping inflation is very high inflation in double and even triple digits. Unlike hyperinflation, wrong government policies or smaller supply shock coupled with wrong government policies can lead to galloping inflation. Galloping inflation, in some cases, can pave the way for hyperinflation, but not always. An episode in the past of hyperinflation could be the Weimar Republic of 1932, or more recently, the Venezuela hyperinflation of 2019, wherein the hyperinflationary rate touched to 283,000%. An episode of galloping inflation would be the oil price shock, or essentially the supply shock, coupled with the wrong monetary and fiscal policies that led to a galloping inflation, wherein inflation rates reached high double digits in the various world economies. So thank you very much for watching this presentation. Do subscribe if you like such content and comment in case of any questions. Thank you.